Hi, this is Bonnie, and today I'm going to show you how to make a heddle. The heddle is the device on your Shoebox loom that allows you to move yarn up and down. This is what your finished product will be like. So I've got my supplies laid out. I have the piece of cardstock. This is a piece of heavy paper that I'm going to use to make my heddle. You can also use the cardboard from the side of a cereal box, works great for this. I have a ruler over here, pencil, scissors. I've got my yarn that I am going to thread through the heddle when I get done making it, a knitting needle, a colored pencil, a crochet hook, and some tape. And you can see as we go along, some of these supplies are nice to have, some of them are really necessary to have, and some of them you can substitute for other things. So before we start, the other thing I want to show you is, if you look at my finished product here, this is the last one I made, it's far from perfect. The holes are all different sizes, the slots are all different sizes, some of the lines are kind of smeared. All of that is okay. This needs to function to lift your yarn and lower your yarn in your loom, but it doesn't need to look pretty. And some of the mistakes that you make along the way are really not that important. It's not important to be perfect, only to make sure that you do your best to make it work in the Shoebox loom. So the first thing we're going to do is spend a little time with our ruler marking what we need to have happen. I'm going to turn my ruler the other direction so that you can see it and move some of my other supplies out of the way here. So we need to make 2 lines, top and bottom, about 5 1/4 inches long. So I'm going to mark the side of my ruler here, and I'm going to make a nice big dark mark so that you can see it. And I'm going to make another one at the 5 1/4 inch mark. So there we go. Our heddle is going to be about 5 inches tall, so now from the bottom of that line I'm going to mark up 5 inches and up 5 inches. And really important that the top also needs to be 5 1/4 inches. And if you don't measure this top part, you're going to end up with something that's longer on one side than the other. So you can see I've got my 4 corners here, and I'm just going to take those. I also, I like to remeasure when I draw the final box. So as I'm drawing the top and bottom, I'm just remeasuring one more time to make sure that those are 5 1/4 inches. And the sides, you can make them 5, you can make them 5 1/4 like the other one. You could actually make them a little taller, a little shorter. The top to bottom doesn't matter that it's exact, but the 5 1/4 part is pretty important. You'll see why in just a minute. Excuse me. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make marks every 1/4 inch all the way along. And I'm just using the 1/4 inch marks on my ruler. I'm holding my ruler in place while I make those marks all the way across. And I'm going to do the same thing at the top, all the way across, every 1/4 inch. These marks are going to become the places where our holes and slots go in our heddle. They don't need to be perfect. The important thing is there need to be the same number of them, because if you're marking and you end up having one too many marks on one end, you end up with problems. So now I'm just going to take my ruler and line it up to the first pair of marks and just draw a line. And I'm just going to do that all the way across for all of these little lines. This is the part where it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. If one of your lines is wiggly or not perfectly straight, that's okay. What we're worried about is the space between the lines, not the lines themselves. So don't get too crazy about this. I'm going a little bit fast so that you don't have to watch me do this all day, but you can take your time and go as slowly as you want. When I'm doing something that needs a lot of measuring, sometimes I get up and take a little walk around the house or go get a drink of water or just Just step up from it for a minute so it doesn't make you quite as crazy. Oh, my pencil lead is running out there, so I'm not making good lines. Make that one again. This is really the only boring part, is making these lines. Once you've done these, we get to really get moving on making the heddle itself, and it gets easier. But measuring can be an important part of some of these things. Again, I'm not working for perfection here. I'm just trying to make sure that my spaces between my holes and slots are about the same. Okay, so there's my paper with all of my lines drawn on it. I'm not going to cut it out yet. I'm going to do that the very last thing. And the reason I'm going to wait until the end to cut that out is it's easier for my hands to work with this big piece of paper than with a smaller piece. So now, in about the middle, I'm just using my colored pencil to show me where I'm going to put the holes. So I'm just making a colored mark in every other space. And that helps me not get confused when I'm cutting things. When you're making holes and cutting things, if you make a hole in the wrong place, that's a little bit of a bummer because then you have to go back. So I've just made all my little colored lines all the way across. Now I'm going to take my handy knitting needle and I'm just going to poke a hole in each one of those spaces. See that hole? You can put something behind your knitting needle, you know, like another piece of paper or something, to kind of catch it as it comes through so you don't poke that straight into your fingers. And you can also use, if you don't have a knitting needle, you can use a hole punch for this. If you use a hole punch, you may have to fold the paper over, and that's fine. We're going to do that in a little bit anyway. You can use a pen. You can use an ice pick. You can use one of those skewers, like from when you do shish kebabs on the barbecue. So I've just made holes all the way across, okay? Now, once you've got your holes done, the next thing we're gonna do is the slots. To do the slots, you're gonna fold your paper over. I recommend folding it over, but don't crease it too hard. The more you press on that paper to make the fold, the more you're gonna kind of damage the paper a little bit and make it weaker. So now I'm positioning my scissors where I can cut a slot, but without cutting into the hole next to it. So I'm just using that fold in the paper to cut my slots. Before I go all the way across, I'm going to show you what I've done. So all I've done, I'm going to press from behind with my fingers. All I've done is create a little slot, a little hard time. There we go. I created this little slot, this little strip of paper all the way across. Now that I've created that slot, and I did it by cutting 2 parallel lines with my scissors. Now that I've done that, I can just take my fingernails and gently tear that piece off, and that's how I get a slot, is by cutting on the fold of the paper and then lifting that part up and just gently tearing it off. Now, it's possible that when you do this, you're going to end up breaking some of your holes. Don't worry, if that happens, all you need to do is take a piece of tape, cover that hole, and that'll reinforce it, and then you can go back and poke through the tape with your knitting needle or hole punch or whatever you're using to poke through. If any of your holes break while you're weaving, that's also how you fix that. You can also do this part with a pocket knife or an X-Acto or craft knife. That's a little more dangerous, so that's why I don't do it that way. But if you've got those tools and you can use them safely, you can do that also. I just recommend this way. Okay, so before I tear the rest of these out, I'm just going to pick some of them up on my knitting needle so that you can see what I've done a little bit better. I've just used my scissors, and I'm in those long boxes that I drew on my piece of paper. I'm in those spaces between the holes, And I'm just cutting these little strips. And when I pick them up with a knitting needle, it's a little bit easier to see where they all are. And that makes it also easier for them to tear. So you're welcome to do it that way if that makes it easier for you to see what you're doing. It does for me. Whoops, I tore my paper a little bit there. If that happens, that's okay too. That can happen, and that's where our friend, the Scotch tape, comes in handy. So I just fixed that. Sometimes when I do this, people ask me if the paper is going to be strong enough to pull up the yarn. And the answer is yes, it actually is. Heddles on looms are made out of all kinds of things. On big looms, sometimes they're made out of steel and they're very strong. And sometimes they're actually just made out of string, and that's strong enough. You just need enough to lift the yarn. So there is my almost finished heddle. The last thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to finally cut out my box. And I wait until the very end to do this because I think it's easier to handle the paper with a full piece of paper. If it's easier for your hands to handle a smaller piece of paper, then you can certainly cut this out earlier before you start doing all that poking around, but I think it helps it not tear. So the last thing I'm going to do with a little bit of my leftover paper here is I am going to make a little handle for my heddle. So I'm just cutting off this scrap at the end, which is about the right size, and I'm going to fold it over a couple of times. I'll make this really nice stiff handle. And I'm just going to put it on the top here and use my Scotch tape to go, and you can use masking tape or blue tape or any kind of tape, duct tape because we're Alaskans. So I'm just taking that and taping that into place. And I taped over the top, and I'm also taping around the side. And the reason I'm taking a moment to do this is because it's going to help me grab on to this piece of paper and make the part that I'm holding inside the box with my hands going up and down. It's making this part a little bit easier for my fingers to grab. It's not necessary, the heddle will work just fine without it. But if you take a moment to do this, I think you're going to find that it helps with your weaving. Okay, so now we have a finished heddle. Our next question is how to thread the yarn. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take my ball of yarn here, and I'm going to first of all measure the strands that I'm putting through the heddle. You'll probably want someplace between 12 and 15 strands. I'm only going to do 5, just so that we don't take forever on the video. So we want about 5 feet. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet. You can go longer if you want to, but 5 feet is sort of the minimum that will make you happy. Drop the scissors there with your loom. Now I'm going to drop the ball of yarn on the floor, match up the loose end off the ball, and I'm going to use the first piece of yarn to measure the next piece. So I'm just drawing the yarn through my hands together until I get to a matched end, and I'm going to cut that end. You can also measure every single strand on your yardstick or ruler, but I think that gets a little bit tedious and boring, so I do it this way. Find it a little bit faster. But again, you can measure everyone on your yardstick if you want to, or you can use this. I'm just matching up the ends, and then I'm drawing. Now I've got the 4th strand, all the strands through my fingers together. When I get to the other end, I'm cutting it. Now with this, I'm using all orange yarn, but I would actually recommend that for your weaving, you actually play around with multiple colors. Any kind of yarn works except for really, really fine or really, really bulky yarns. You want something kind of medium weight that is going to go through your heddle well. So I've got these 5 ends, and again, I'm only doing 5, but you will probably want 10, 12, 15, someplace in there. I'm going to tie a knot at the end. And now I've got my loose ends on the other side. I'm going to thread those through my heddle. So you want to be in the middle of your heddle. Since I have only 5 strands, I need 3 slots and 2 holes. So I'm just going to go through the middle here. I'm going to thread the slots first. And I recommend that when you thread it, you hold the end that's close to your knot. And you'll see why in a minute. It helps it not get tangled. So the slots are easy. Just press the yarn up to the slot, pull it through, and then hold that yarn away from you so that you don't get it tangled with the others. Now I'm going to put the next bit of yarn through the next slot, and again I'm just pressing it up to the slot, pulling it through, and kind of toss it the other direction. I'm tossing it the other direction so you can kind of see I've got 2 sets of threads going here. I've got the ones behind the heddle that I haven't threaded yet, and I've got the ones in front of the heddle that have been threaded through. If you keep those separated, it'll help you not get tangled up while you're doing this. Pull the next one through the slot, pull it away from you, and you can see what's starting to happen is I've got my knot on the back side, I've got these threads on the front side that have already been threaded, and then I've got my 2 left that are going to go through the holes. Now, to get through the holes, you will probably want your trusty crochet hook. If you don't have a crochet hook, that's okay, it's not the end of the world. You can thread them just like you would thread a needle. So I've stuck my crochet hook through, and this does help, but again, you can do it just with your fingers like you would thread a needle. I'm catching my yarn on my crochet hook, and I'm just going to pull it through here. When you get to this point, sometimes people are tempted to use the crochet hook to pull the yarn. I wouldn't do that because it's too easy to break your heddle that way. So I'm just pulling on the thread itself. You can see I'm using my thumb to kind of hold the cardboard in place as I do that. And there's the first one through the hole. So I've got 3 slots and 1 hole. I've got only 1 piece of yarn left, and I'll show you this one more time. So I'm taking my hook, I'm putting it through that hole. On the other side, I'm catching the yarn. Sometimes you have to kind of pull the yarn against the hook, and then I'm using the hook to pull the yarn through. When you get to this side, try not to use the hook to pull on the yarn. It's a little too easy to break your heddle that way. And then I pull my strings through. And there you have your heddle with your threads all through it. One last thing before you move on, and by the way, if you have one of the kits that had the popsicle stick heddle in it, those work exactly the same way to rethread them. Now I'm going to just take my yarn and straighten that out for storage until I'm ready to use this on my shoebox loom. So on this side I have the knot, and I'm just going to look and make sure that none of these threads are looped out. So if this were a big loop like that here, I would want to make sure that that loop got straightened out and pulled snug before I get ready to store my yarn. Now I'm just going to pull gently on these threads, and I'm doing the same thing as I was when I was measuring them in the first place. I'm holding them all together so that I can straighten them out against each other and make sure that they're still the same length. You can see I got a little bit tangled here, right? So I'm going to straighten out that tangle, smooth them out, straighten out the tangle, smooth them out, and I'm going to tie a little knot at the other side. All this does is make sure that your threads stay secure and all the same length. And now you're ready to put your new heddle and your warp threads onto your shoebox loom.